Chapter 1. The First Firekeeper. Since the beginning of our journey with Dark Souls, the Firekeepers have guided and aided us along the way, be it directly or indirectly. But we've seen fundamental changes of how the Firekeepers perform their duty. From Firekeepers being corporeal manifestations of their bonfires, and thus keeping the flame alive so that we may use its strength to grow, to a Firekeeper who waits for her champion beside a bonfire that has long been extinguished. These curiosities beg questions, but perhaps before we answer those questions, it's more important to answer who or what came before, to answer who was the first Firekeeper. A Firekeeper's sight is the topic of uncertainty, no doubt, but it is important when discussing the first Firekeeper, which I'll explain more about later. For now, let me unravel, the best that I can, the reason for the differences between the Firekeepers of Lordran and the Firekeepers of Dark Souls 3. The key difference being their blindness. As the Firekeeper in Dark Souls 3 tells you, it is forbidden for them to have eyes. But in Dark Souls 1, this isn't quite the case. Anastasia had her tongue removed. The Lady of Darkling is said to hide a hideous form under her armor, but the fair lady does seem to be blind, as when equipped with the witch ring and able to talk to her, she believes you to be Quelaag. But something they do have in common is that they all seem to be prisoners, whether literally or of their circumstances, which may have been the original criteria for Firekeepers. Whereas by the time of Dark Souls 3, our Firekeeper seems more than willing to perform her duty, and doesn't seem bound to do so. Again, she is even waiting for her bonfire to be lit. And we also meet Irina, who's on her journey to become a Firekeeper. Even though Ludleth does suggest that just like the Unkindled, the Firekeeper is a prisoner, but the main difference between the two sets is that we see now that they are forbidden to have eyes. As the eyes of the first Firekeeper, found within the untended grave state, that the eyes contain the light that was lost by all Firekeepers to come, and would otherwise reveal to them things they should never see, and is probably why they at least seem less imprisoned, as removing their eyes would likely remove the odds of them abandoning their posts or the flame. So it would seem that now Firekeepers, at least since after the second linking of the fire, willingly accept being blinded to the light, or probably more appropriately, being blinded to the truth of the world. Instead, they embrace the grandest and longest running lie to keep the Age of Fire alive, and remain willfully ignorant of the truth they shunned. Although, to be fair, I'm sure that as time dragged on, that it was far more ambiguous than that to the women who sought to be Firekeepers. In fact, they seem to be treated with more reverence and respect now. As the Firekeeper Tower Key tells us, that after a Firekeeper has served her purpose, she's led into true darkness, where she enjoys her long-deserved sleep. And this long sleep, I believe, is a hint that leads us back to the first Firekeeper. As the fire waneth, does she lie by the dark, all for the sake of man. Princess Filianor, the youngest daughter of the great Lord Gwyn, gifted to the pygmies and the ringed city to hold the dark at bay, to hide the truth from the world. Upon inspection of Filianor, we can see that some sort of darkness has leaked from her eyes, or from where I suspect are her empty eye sockets. The eyes of the first firekeeper are said to contain the light that was lost, and in theory the absence of light would invite darkness, and perhaps that darkness in time would overflow, which I believe is what is spilling from where Filianor's eyes once were. Our firekeeper tells us, "Ashen One, my thanks for the eyes thou'st given me. But firekeepers are not meant to have eyes. It is forbidden. These will reveal, through a sliver of light, frightful images of betrayal. A world without fire. Ashen One, is this truly thy wish?" The last sliver of light from Filianor's eyes reveal all the things she slumbers to hide. It looks beyond the veil that we only see after Filianor perishes, and we see the world covered in ash, awaiting its last breath as the flame dies out. It also sees images of betrayal. Which betrayal is hard to say. It could be the betrayal of her father and the gods who uprooted her from her home and gave her away with the enormous responsibility of holding the dark at bay. It could be the images of the betrayal of the pygmies by the gods, who were manipulated into believing them and their soul were bad for this world. But what is a firekeeper without a fire to tend? We don't see Filianor stoking any flames anywhere nearby. The answer relates to the reason she slumbers to begin with: to contain the dark soul, and that started even during the war with the ancient dragons, with the seal of fire the gods placed upon the armor of early men, out of the fear of the rising power of humanity. A seal that only allows the dark to grow so much. A seal to contain the dark from reaching its potential. It started by being placed upon humanity, until the day it became placed upon the very dark soul itself. It was in fact the same seal of fire that was transferred to the very soul when Gwyn linked the flame. Because without this seal, the dark soul would grow to threaten the age of fire, would champion the Dark Lord to usher in the age of dark that Gwyn and the gods trembled at the thought of. So this seal of fire would need tending to, for if its flames faded, the truth would be shattered and only dark would remain. The dark sign is the flame Filianor tends to, for she is its firekeeper. And when we see her demise, we see the dark soul usurped without resistance. Filianor saw all of this before the events unfolded, and her eyes were likely a long-forgotten, forbidden, and eventually passed around artifact that, when given to our firekeeper, reveals to her the truth of the world and of humanity. And since this is the canonical ending, it allows her to properly tend to humanity's fire, but only opposite of its original keeper, Filianor. Rather, our firekeeper tends to the dark sign by wresting the first flame that binds it from its mantle, and allows it to die out, progressing the world back to its natural cycle, as the light that was lost is found again. But one day, tiny flames will dance across the darkness, like embers linked by lords past. If you are enjoying this content and want to support the channel even further, consider checking out my Patreon. There, you can get access to exclusive sleep content, vote for which sleep stories come next, get early access to videos, and more. Chapter 2: The Lothric Curse. Mind you, the mantle of Lord interests me none. The fire-linking curse, the legacy of lords, let it all fade into nothing, for that is our curse. We all know that the path to linking the fire is a cursed one, and that the Lothric family will produce worthy heirs to this flame, even through unspeakable means. But what is Prince Lothric's curse, and how did it come to be? While we exclusively find the pus of man within the kingdom of Lothric, it's unclear exactly what they are. Though I'd say it's safe to assume it's some form of chaotic humanity, given the hollows it sprouts from, and that they drop dark gems, which are said to be born of disembodied humanity. The gods and their associates are certainly no strangers to experimentation, whether to extend their life, legacy, or kingdom. And I believe the pus of man was one such experiment. Since Dark Souls 1, we have been burning humanity to embolden the fire and preserve ourselves. Why not apply that on a grander scale? Why not stuff the air of fire close to brimming with it, in hopes of extending the fire for even longer? Not a terrible theory in retrospect, and surely not coincidental that we find pieces of the disembodied humanity from the pus of man, and right outside where we would find Lothric's king Osiris, who has also been known to experiment. It would also explain why the pus of man appears from Udic's Gunder, considering he was supposed to link the flame, but failed to do so for one reason or another, and was very likely a part of the royal Lothric family. And a Lothric royal family tree would certainly be something interesting to see. We know Osiris was king, and at least had some children with Guinevere, the queen of Lothric. But the only one we can confirm is Ocelot. As Osiris says, "I will not give him up, for he is all that I have." My point being that the heirs the Lothric family were producing just weren't living up to the mantle of Lord. Until Prince Lothric. But what made him special? The short answer, I believe, is incest. All throughout varying mythologies, royal families practiced incest as a means of keeping their bloodline pure. Prince Lothric is a result of this same principle. The world was running out of options, as Lothric heirs just weren't worthy enough to link the flame. But what if it produced an heir of the original royal family's bloodline? So Guinevere and Gwyndolin came together to produce an heir specifically designed to link the flame. Think about it. Lothric was born a frail and shriveled child, which is an indicator of being born from incest. But maybe this frailty also came from Gwendolyn, who was skinny and frail himself. They also shared the same light blonde hair color. And finally, they also share the same voice actor, and you can take that with a grain of salt, however. Maybe even Lorien was born of Guinevere and Gwendolyn as well. He shares the same light hair color and likes to wear a similar helmet in design to Gwendolyn's. But I guess that idea isn't super important right now. The point being that Prince Lothric was the culmination of ideas meant to be the perfect heir. So he was procreated through the original royal bloodline and stuffed full of humanity, a true testament to the fire-linking legacy. And some would likely say he was created through unspeakable means. Of course, we never see the pus of man revealed from Lothric, and maybe that is because he accepted his curse, but not for the reasons he was created. As we know, he turned away from his duties after a certain scholar bent his ear, and he was content to abandon his role and watch it all fade to nothing, and was likewise joined by his brother Lorien, who embraced Lothric's curse. But what exactly is that curse? Well, we know that humanity is cursed with undeath. So if a godlike being was stuffed full of humanity, he probably acquired a somewhat similar curse. Historically, the undead did a great job at being fodder for the flame, so this wasn't necessarily the worst plan that could have been thought of. We even see this curse take effect when fighting the twin princes. When Lorien falls, Lothric goes to his side and tells him to rise, as that is their curse. And Lorien does indeed rise and continue the fight, albeit weaker and weaker each time, or until Lothric himself is killed. That is quite similar to the curse of undeath, continuing to rise after death, losing pieces of yourself each time. But perhaps, since the curse is shared between the brothers, undeath doesn't apply to both. And that idea might also be seen between the two wyverns perched on either side of Lothric Castle, both inflicted by the pus of man, but when one dies, so too does the other. This idea is supplemented with the fact that the twin princes are resistant to dark damage, whereas all the other gods, or those related, in the Dark Souls games were notoriously susceptible to it. Prince Lothric is even sympathetic of the Unkindled's mission or expectations, since they really do have a lot in common. Meant to save the world by doing the bidding of others, ultimately to your own sacrifice. But when defeated, Lothric offers what I believe is genuine respite. This spot marks our grave, but you may rest here too, if you like. I'm unsure exactly how the bond between Lorien and Lothric became so strengthened that they cared only for one another. But it always seemed Lorien was poised, at least by others, to be the king of Lothric, and with his little brother, reignite the Age of Fire. Lothric would need a strong king with a strong claim. But just as Lothric refused to be a cog in the Age of Fire system, so too does Lorien. and they embraced each other and shared their curse. And maybe that was the final middle finger to those who thought to control them, the sharing of their curse. For if Lothric dies linking the fire, Lorien dies as well, and Lothric would be left without a king. Chapter 3: Rosaria's Fingers. Ah, so you've chosen to serve Rosaria after all. She will be pleased with me for finding her another finger. But be warned, my friend. Rosaria's fingers need only fetch tongues for their mistress. Otherwise, we are free, unchained. Like Yellowfinger, you can choose to believe that all fingers share camaraderie, but do not force your romance on the rest of us. We encounter 3 of Rosaria's fingers in the game, but who are they? And maybe more curious, who were they? As that is the focal point of Rosaria's powers, rebirth, turning you into someone else entirely. Rosaria is certainly an interesting enigma herself. Her subjects offer her the tongues of their victims. Let's start with the most basic of Rosaria's fingers, and that's Longfinger Kirk. His armor reads, Armor of Kirk, the notorious Knight of Thorns. A dense patch of thorns grows from its surface, a fitting item for the murderous Kirk, for even the simple act of rolling can damage enemies when wearing this attire, which is almost verbatim to his armor description in Dark Souls 1. And to be honest, I don't think there's anything particularly special about this guy, as it's likely the same notorious person from way back when he was serving the fair lady. Or I suppose it could be somebody who found his armor and was rebirthed as Kirk. But I don't think the distinction is all that important, because we don't really get anything else that looks further into who Kirk was. Next is Yellowfinger Hazel. Which finger is considered the yellow one, I wondered. I have no idea. It's incredibly obvious the connection Hazel has with Ulasil before even reading the descriptions. But we'll read the one for her crown nonetheless. It states, Crown made in imitation of a divine creature of Ulasil, land of ancient golden sorceries. Xanthus clothing is the mark of a researcher of lost sorceries, and the oversized crown is emblematic of their work. Such a curious pursuit is surely nothing to be ashamed of. Of course, the crown being the imitation of the mushroom of Ulasil, and I would assume namely Elizabeth. She seemed to be the closest to Dusk, who was the princess of Ulasil. So if the mushrooms had leaders, Elizabeth probably fit the bill for that, and the one of whom the Xanthus crown imitates. Now, I've always thought that Farron's Legion, or at the very least the idea behind it, began in Ulasil. They were the first land to fall to the abyss, and really the only named land that we know of. Sure, there is New Londo, but they willingly embraced it. So Farron's Legion originating in and or from Ulasil makes a lot of sense. So it's interesting that Hazel is the daughter of the leader of the Legion's acolytes. The Farron Hail sorcery reads, entrusted to the leader of the Legion's acolytes, and apparently a sorcery of his daughter Hazel that was refined by a crystal sage. Originally, it made me ponder the idea of what if Hazel is just Dusk rebirthed. We knew Dusk as the princess of Ulasil. She taught us her golden sorceries that were never offensive spells, but more peaceful in nature. Perhaps the idea behind the morality of Ulasil spells changed after Manus ravaged their home, and it wouldn't be so fitting for a princess to be so aggressive with her sorceries. It's also interesting to consider that her pickaxe weapon is also the catalyst for her spells, which isn't often the case. Another example of this would be Manus's catalyst, both a weapon and a spell medium. And Dusk did spend a fair amount of time with Manus after he kidnapped her. Not to mention, you learn the proper bow gesture from both Dusk and Hazel. And Hazel invades you in the area where you find Dusk's antiquated set. But of course, that could all be circumstantial. Perhaps Hazel could be a descendant of Dusk, or maybe just a huge fan. The last named finger we encounter is Ring Finger Leonard. His garb reads, Leonard was born into royalty, which is believed to be the reason for his skill in both sorcery and swordsmanship. Indeed, the dingy garb is in fact embroidered with gold thread, betraying its purpose as military wear designed for a noble. Leonard is incredibly interesting indeed. He's often speculated to be the firstborn of Rosaria, the one who took her tongue. But I guess the term firstborn in relation to the goddess of rebirth could be subjective. Is it the firstborn of Guinevere, or the first one to be rebirthed by her once she became Rosaria, the goddess of rebirth? Or what if he's the lastborn of Guinevere? I think either of those actually make a lot of sense. We already know he's royalty. Now let's read the description for his silver mask. In his youth, Leonhard suffered grave burns to his entire body, his face in particular, which he hid beneath his mask, was terribly scalded. He abstained from restoring these injuries, even after becoming a finger of Rosaria. Royalty, with grave burns all over his body. That literally only makes me think of the Lothric bloodline, who had consistently experimented on their children, always attempting to create the perfect heir to the flame by any means necessary. That's pretty specific. Leonhard's weapon of choice also ties him to the Lothric royal family, as his crescent moon sword is imbued with the power of the moon. And on top of that, he inherited this weapon. Which of course is interesting, because the King of Lothric was infatuated with his studies of moonlight and the power of the moon, associated of course with Seath the Pale Drake. Could Leonhard have been Ocelot, the lastborn of the Queen of Lothric? He uses the Obscuring Ring, which is similar to the Dragon Crossbreed's power to go invisible. Is that the reason we don't find baby Ocelot in the fight with Osiros? Maybe. I think there's just as much stock in the idea of him being the firstborn as well. But to me it seems obvious that the royalty he was a part of was in Lothric. The rest is up to you to decide. but those are the 3 fingers we encounter. But naturally, 3 fingers don't make a hand. Perhaps a player character was meant to fill in the title of the 4th finger. Chapter 4, Rosaria, Queen of Sunlight. Thou hast journeyed far and overcome much. Come hither, child. I am Guinevere, daughter of Lord Gwyn and Queen of Sunlight. If thou so needest, I shall devote all to thine safety. Guinevere, Princess of Sunlight, Goddess of Bounty and Fertility, Queen of Lothric, Mother of Rebirth. Quite an impressive resume, to be sure. But before I explain why or how I think Guinevere became Rosaria, I think it's first important to peg her as the Queen of Lothric, as I believe it lends to Rosaria's story, as well as helps to make sense of why Guinevere would even be in Lothric. The best way to do this is to simply look at the divine blessings from both Dark Souls 1 and 3. The divine blessing is described in 1 as holy water blessed by Guinevere, who is cherished by all as the symbol of bounty and fertility. And in 3, it's described as the holy water blessed by the Queen of Lothric, who was initially revered as the goddess of bounty and fertility, and after giving birth to her youngest, Ocelot, she quietly disappeared. The comparison and similarities are pretty clear, and I'd be hard-pressed to believe these 2 descriptions are talking about 2 separate entities who happen to basically be the exact person. But what's more is the Sun Princess ring from both Dark Souls 1 and 3. In 1, it describes Guinevere's departure from Anor Londo and later becoming wife to Flame God Flann, whereas the ring in 3 also describes her departure from Anor Londo, but it doesn't mention Flann. It just simply states that she became a wife and mother who raised several heavenly children. So Flann could be a retcon, as we know that at least near the end, the Queen of Lothric was married to Osiros. The important piece is the mention of Guinevere having several heavenly children, as the Queen of Lothric is often referenced as having raised several heavenly children. If all of that isn't enough to convince you, well, you could also consider this. Joining the Princess's Guard in Dark Souls 1 grants you the ability to use Guinevere's 2 signature miracles, Soothing and Bountiful Sunlight, both of which are said to be granted to the Maidens of Guinevere, which is a bit more interesting if you know that back in the day, the Maidens of Queens were often her daughters. And a bit sad to remember that you get these 2 miracles from 2 of the Picasas in the Duke's archives, which could have been 2 of Guinevere's first children. But that isn't super important to this story. What is that we can transpose the dancer's soul into the soothing sunlight miracle. And the dancer is of course referred to as the distant daughter of the formal royal family, which in this case I assume means the Lothric royal family. So the dancer being a daughter of the Queen of Lothric, who also wears the mirage-like Aurora veil, which is said to be an article of the old gods, permitted only for direct descendants of the old royal family, which is of course in reference to the original royal family of Gwyn and his children, isn't a surprise. The beauty of Dark Souls' lore is that for the most part you can write your own stories and believe and enjoy it however you want. But for me, the evidence is far too overwhelming for me to believe the Queen of Lothric is anyone but Gwynevere. Now, let's look at why it also makes sense that Gwynevere has become Rosaria, the Mother of Rebirth. Starting with the obvious, I don't think it's a stretch to believe that Rosaria, the entity who can rebirth people into someone else, could also alter her own appearance. Not to mention the concepts of fertility and rebirth aren't vastly different from one another. And since Gwynevere was the goddess of fertility, I assume she'd excel at the birthing or rebirthing process. And since bounty and fertility are, as far as we know, only associated with Gwynevere, it's interesting to see literal symbols of fertility all around Rosaria's bedchambers. In many reliefs around the room, we see designs and concepts that are incredibly symbolic of a woman's reproductive system. In one, there are goats and satyrs, which are also age-old symbols of fertility, and the abundance of blossomed flowers as well. You could consider their shape to be similar to the uterus, and the ribbons to resemble fallopian tubes. The abundance of vegetation could also represent bounty. In another relief, we see not just another design of the female reproductive system, but one made from oak branches and acorns, which are another widely used symbol of fertility. Acorns were also often used in rituals of rebirth. The cribs around the bedchamber could also represent fertility or rebirth, or even both. But obviously the parallels are apparent around Rosaria's room. And that's all not even to mention that during Leonard's quest line, he takes Rosaria's soul to the very room in Anor Londo where the illusion of Gwynevere was in Dark Souls 1. And transposing Rosaria's soul, we get the second of Gwynevere's exclusive miracles, bountiful sunlight. But there is a distinct difference this time that I think is interesting. In Dark Souls 1, the miracles were referenced as granted to maidens of Gwynevere, that dropped from the Picasas we can assume were her maidens, and the soothing sunlight transposed from the dancer's soul says the same, that it was granted to maidens. Except the difference this one time is that bountiful sunlight in Dark Souls 3 doesn't mention being granted to maidens of Gwynevere. It simply says it's a miracle granted by Gwynevere. I think the distinction was made because the miracle is transposed by Rosaria or Gwynevere's soul itself. It's a small but very important distinction. There are already so many things that I believe prove Rosaria to be who Gwynevere eventually became after all she had been through. There is even the Aurora Mirage-like veils, permitted only to the old gods and royal family, hanging throughout her bedchambers. And there is more that lends to this theory by believing that Gwynevere was the Queen of Lothric. And I believe that above all else, Gwynevere valued her children, and protecting those dear to her took precedence. Even upon entering the princess's guard, she vows to protect you above all else. In the time of Lothric, things aren't quite going so well for some of the queen's children, namely Gertrude, who was locked away high above in the Grand Archives, and the dancer, who was taken by Sullivan to Irithyll and was eventually warped into a beast. So it's interesting to see man-grubs, those who worship Rosaria and have used her services one too many times and become something a bit less than human, in peculiar places in regards to those two daughters. We see one up in the banisters of the Grand Archives near Gertrude, and we see a dead one making its way into Irithyll, which, in my mind, was Rosaria using her servants in an attempt to protect her daughters. It's also interesting to consider that when Aldrich decided he would devour the gods, he started with the old gods. Gwyndolin, to be specific, after Sullivan locked him away for the Saint of the Deep to devour. Similarly, Rosaria appears to have been locked away as well, as we can see the gates around her chambers, and it was in the Cathedral of the Deep, no less. But of course, her gate was eventually broken into, and it's made to distinctively appear as if it was broken and forced open, probably by her man-grub servants to keep her from getting devoured by Aldrich, as we can see dead man-grubs surround the chambers, along with the surviving ones still guarding their goddess. And the sludge all over the wall could suggest that Aldrich was there and attempted to devour her, but was thwarted. Of course, that's all inconsequential, but interesting nonetheless, if we're considering Rosaria to be Guinevere, an old god and sister to Gwyndolin. The last thing we'll talk about is Rosaria's inability to speak. The obscuring ring says that Rosaria was robbed of her tongue by her firstborn and has been waiting for their return ever since, which could mean a couple different things. I think most people correlate it to mean her tongue was physically removed by her firstborn, especially considering her covenant offers her the tongues of their victims. But the pale tongues describe the ritual as originally being a practice of an infamous troop of invaders who offered them to their speechless goddess. But I don't think that has to mean that Rosaria's tongue was physically removed. People have taken vows of silence before. People have also just fallen silent for long periods of time after becoming grief-stricken. And robbed of her tongue isn't mutually exclusive to having it removed. Just like saying someone took your breath away could go both ways, I suppose. What if, after everything else we see that Guinevere has been through, her firstborn simply broke her heart so badly she just lost who she was, including her voice? If the dancer is her firstborn, her daughter siding with and making vows with Pontiff Sullivan could have put her over the edge, especially considering Sullivan's endgame and the things that he had already done to their family. That could also be the reference to the line from the Divine Blessing about her quietly disappearing after giving birth to Ocelot, which, let's be honest, was probably another huge tragedy itself. So she quite literally faded away, robbed of her tongue by her distant daughter, and then reborn, heartbroken, waiting for her daughter to return to her, but against all odds, still a mother to all who wanted or needed her. Chapter 5: Irina and Eygon. Far below the undead settlement, through sewers and graves, we find a young maiden named Irina, locked inside of a small cell. When we find her, she says, "Ah, who's there? Is someone there? Anyone?" Please, whoever you are, touch me. The dark surrounds me, nibbles at my flesh. Little creatures, they never stop biting. So please, hold out your hand and touch me. These little creatures are humanities. Irina tried and failed to become a firekeeper for unknown reasons. We know from Dark Souls 1 that a firekeeper's soul is a draw for humanity and held within their bosoms, below just a thin layer of skin, are swarms of humanity that writhe and squirm. But there is so much more to this story. Outside of Irina's cell is her companion Eygon, a knight of Karim. He speaks about how he really doesn't care about the girl, but agrees to ally with you for as long as you assure her safety. According to the description on Eygon's armor, the Morn armor, it says, "A Karim knight will dedicate an entire career to attending a single maiden, just as Morn once served one goddess alone." So let's briefly look a little more into Morn. Morn's Great Hammer reads, "Great Hammer bestowed upon Karim knights who demonstrate outstanding strength and unwavering faith. Decorated by a ward of Karim Temple and imbued with the twisted rage of Apostle Morn. Skill, Morn's Rage. Stick the weapon into the earth and emit a powerful shockwave. Also similar to Perseverance, temporarily boost poise and reduces damage received. So the weapon is imbued with the rage of Morn. I think we can slightly see this rage in Eygon's personality. Morn's ring says, "A malformed ring given to knights of Karim. Boosts miracles." Morn served the goddess Catha, and later became an apostle of the Archbishop. They labored together to provide comfort to the suffering. So what we know about Morn is basically that he served Catha alone, and the Order of the Knights of Karim have followed in that tradition of serving their lives to a single maiden. Catha, we know, is the goddess of tears. Catha first being introduced to us as a goddess in Dark Souls 2. Let's read the description of Catha's chime from Dark Souls 2. Sacred chime blessed by Catha, goddess of tears. Catha, the goddess of tears, is known as a compassionate being that is with us in times of tragedy. But some believe that she is a demoness that guides us toward misfortune. This is where things got a little interesting. The last part sheds a completely different light on this goddess. Perhaps she's a demoness that guides us towards misfortune. Let's look at that concept in contrast with what we learn in Dark Souls 3. The description for Morn's helmet reads, "Modeled on Morn, the Archbishop's apostle. The helm is of perfect likeness to the stone heads lining the cathedral." Modeled on seems specifically different than worn by to me. So it gives me the impression that we're inclined to believe that Morn looks like how his armor appears. Let's read the description for Catha's chime from Dark Souls 3. Sacred chime blessed by Catha, goddess of tears. Rare even amongst Karim clerics. Affected by intelligence, a rare thing for miracle catalysts. And also agreeable with miracles that lean towards the dark. Its existence is concealed in the name of the Archbishop, as it is anathema. So, what I get from this is a goddess who might possibly be a demon is served by her apostle, who happens to look like a demon too. And the chime she blesses increases their dark damage. All that is a bit fishy. And all that seems indicative to the testament that Keitha is a demoness herself. Not that all demons in Dark Souls are necessarily evil themselves. We know Anor Londo used the help of demons to transport the chosen undead to and from Sin's Fortress. I think it's easy to assume this through the Way of White, which appear to be the predominant church and religion in the Dark Souls universe. So I don't think it's far off to think that Karim is following the same or similar teachings of the Way of White, especially after considering the Braille Divine Tome of Karim, which description reads, "A sacred Braille tome from Karim, filled with advanced miracles." In the Way of White, there is a tradition of placing great faith in the words of the blind, and Braille tomes are not unusual. The reason I want to bring in ties to the Way of White is to relate it to the linking of the fire and the desire to always continue the Age of Fire. Here, in the Undead settlement, we see Eygon with his maiden Irina, who was to become a firekeeper. Now, we don't know all of the tales of the Knights of Karim and each of their maidens, but I believe it likely they were all set out to become firekeepers, to keep tending the flame throughout all the continuations of the Age of Fire. But there is something different about Irina. She failed to become a firekeeper. I think that's the first time we've seen something like that. How does one fail to become a firekeeper? We are never given a specific answer, but Irina does tell us that she came to this land to become a firekeeper, and mentions that your touch freed her from the dark, which a firekeeper's soul is a draw for the dark, or humanity, which seems like a good thing, at least in terms of trying to become a firekeeper. Then she says that she is weak and unfit to tend the flames, which is incredibly vague. It, to me anyways, kind of sounds like an excuse or beating around the bush. Anyway, it is uncertain to if she came to this conclusion on her own, or if it was something she was told repeatedly and simply accepted as truth. There are two outcomes to Irina's story we can witness: a dark path and a light path. The dark path is initiated by giving Irina a dark miracle tome, and purchasing a dark miracle from her will cause Eygon to attempt to take her away from you. The two from Karim can then be found by the Eudix Gunder bonfire. Upon following after them, Eygon will be hostile. You will be forced to kill him. After killing him, and having already reintroduced the dark back into Irina's life, she becomes a lost version of herself again, calling out if anyone is there. "Someone, please touch me. The dark surrounds me, nibbles at my flesh. Little creatures, they never stop biting. So please, hold out your hand and touch me." You have the option to reach out and touch her, but doing so will amount to nothing. She feels not your touch and continues to plead for someone to touch her, and keep the things from eating away at her. However, after Eygon is out of the picture, the armor he donned is purchasable from the Shrine Handmaiden. Choosing to touch Irina while having Eygon's gauntlets on will trigger her dark ending. Oh, you again. Touch me one last time and kill me as you promised you would. Oh, the Knight of Karim is always true to his word. So here is what I think the deal with Eygon is. I think he is not who he is supposed to be, but in a good way. He plays the tough guy card the whole time, but he cares for Irina a great deal. So much so that he would rather convince her that she's too weak to become a firekeeper, to keep her away from the corruption and hardships that come with it. Now, I'm not saying that he went about this the right way. I mean, he did lock her in a cage. But this is a Knight of Karim. They are tested in their mettle. They are resilient. They are strong and unwavering in their faith. To stray from a mission would be a thing unheard of in reference to Knights of Karim, especially considering what could be going on behind the scenes. The manipulation and twisting of a maybe demon goddess and her maybe demon-appearing apostle. That reeks of some sort of deception to me. More so when we think of the lengths people have gone to manipulate others into extending the age of fire time and time again. So I believe that he is trying his best to protect her. And for someone like him, I think it would take an awful lot just to do so. But perhaps that is just who Eygon is, though he hides it behind the mask of a demon. But under all that hard, thick skin, he is soft. More of a testament to that is the moaning shield he carries. Its description reads, a deformed great shield given to Eygon of Karim upon being conferred to knighthood. The giant woman's face that protects Eygon is that of his sister, some years his senior. Skill moan. Offer a gentle prayer to the shield, causing the woman's face to give out a low moan and attract enemies. So Eygon carries a memento of his sister, and what's more is the skill this shield provides to attract all enemies to Eygon, which seems to indicate he is very protective of others, or at least of Irina. Perhaps it could be in reference to Eygon's sister looking out for him when they were younger, and that could be where his principles came from. So the light path for Irina is different. In this story arc, she actually becomes a firekeeper and takes up residence in the tower of the dead firekeepers in Firelink Shrine. When this happens, Eygon disappears, and we can buy his armor from the Shrine Handmaiden. We can also go to the location we first met Irina and find his hammer and shield. This could be indicative of two things. I think at first glance, it could be that he considered his duty fulfilled, and thus his career complete. His armor description did state that Karim Knights will dedicate their entire career to a single maiden. But I don't think that is the case. His shield, with the face of his sister, seems to be more of an heirloom that was passed on to him when he ascended into knighthood. I don't think he would leave that along with his career. Rather, I think this move shows his true care for Irina. He trusts the unkindled now. He feared for her becoming a firekeeper, the corruption and agony that would come with it. But perhaps treating Irina with kindness shows him that it doesn't have to be seen as a curse. That the chosen ash is looking out for her best interests, and unknowingly did a better job than he ever could. So he leaves. He knows she's in better hands, and he forsakes his duty, goes. Which would be a pretty huge thing, considering the dedication of the Kareem Knights. There's also one more interesting thing I want to draw your attention to, and that is Irina's ashes, which read, Irina was a frail woman. This frailty led to her becoming a saint of Kareem, and to her grand treachery. So Irina had a grand treachery. Could she and Eygon have both decided to shirk her journey of becoming a firekeeper? Or was becoming a firekeeper her treachery?